Hey guys, and welcome to today's live stream. We're going to be talking all about pelvic floor in the context of lower back pain. So a little bit about how this plays into the role of our core. We talk a lot about this in the Back in Shape program when it comes to strengthening and protecting our lower back. So hopefully you guys are going to get some really good information here. As always, we've got the Q&A section at the end of the live stream. So if you do have any questions, post those in the comments below. And we do really want you guys to engage. If you've got questions about this topic, then guide us. It's a little bit more of a complex topic in some ways. So any questions you've got, post those in the comments below, and Lara's the other side of the camera, so she'll be able to read those out to us as we go along, and we'll get to those at the end of the live stream. If you are new to the channel, please do consider subscribing. We do these live streams every single weekday. There's always a different topic. So if you've got any particular interest, then hit that notification bell so you make sure you know when we go live on YouTube and Facebook. And with that being said, let's get into today's topic on pelvic floor and lower back pain. Okay, so pelvic floor, this is a really important part of our body. It provides stability from the bottom, and we're going to talk a little bit about sort of who is going to potentially suffer with problems in the pelvic floor, a little bit about the research I'll touch on very briefly, and then we're going to get into what can you do to improve it, how does it play into our core stability in general, and then a little bit of guidance going forwards from there as well towards the end in that Q&A section at the very end. So first and foremost, what is the pelvic floor? Well, it's basically a collection of muscles that's in contact with the saddle or the seat as you're sat down, maybe on a horse or on a bike. It makes up the floor of our sort of abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity. And if we look at our midsection, obviously we have our spine coming through the middle here. We talk a lot in the Back in Shape program about the importance of our core to be able to provide stability in a sort of a transverse plane horizontally to protect the spine as we're going through various movements on a daily basis or through the physical exercises in the rehab that we're doing. So that's really important. But then we've got the roof, which is the diaphragm, and then we've got the pelvic floor that sits underneath here. And ideally, when we're going through any of these exercises, everything should be engaged to provide stability. And a lot of people will have sort of that innate understanding and that innate ability to engage the pelvic floor very effectively, which is really good. But there are certain groups of people that are a little bit more vulnerable, and that's what I'm going to sort of spend a little bit of time touching on now. Now, when it comes to the pelvic floor research dysfunction, or pelvic floor dysfunction, or PFD as it talks about in a lot of the research, there is a heavy focus on the gynecological component, on post-childbirth and those sorts of issues, because essentially that process is very strenuous on the mother as you're giving birth, and therefore it can strain this region here, this pelvic floor, and that can then lead to challenges that ladies will typically face subsequent to that. And unfortunately or fortunately, right after pregnancy, very similar to ladies that have a C-section, who coincidentally won't necessarily suffer as much with pelvic floor issues, although they suffer with abdominal issues. Right after you've had the childbirth, there's not necessarily that impetus, that emphasis on your health and well-being, your rehabilitation, bar obviously the vital signs, etc., and making sure that we rehabilitate those structures that have been placed under a lot of strain. And we talk about this a lot when it comes to C-sections for the core, but also natural deliveries and natural births, whether they've got some minor complications or otherwise, really has a massive impact on this pelvic floor, which I think is why the overwhelming majority of the research does tend to look at the gynecological sort of component of this. Now, there are also other issues that can put challenges on the pelvic floor, and these are present in everyone. And one of the big ones is going to be sort of chronic digestive issues and constipation. Those sorts of issues over an extended period of time can start to create issues with the pelvic floor. And then obviously there's the challenges of things like heavy lifting I've put down here, or high impact exercises. Now, I would suggest that actually a lot of that, if we've done that consistently as we've been growing up and continued it through our life, then I don't think those problems are necessarily going to be there. But the lady that's maybe been through a rather challenging childbirth then partakes or gets back into high impact exercises, or heavy lifting of heavy weights, maybe at work or otherwise, may, if she's not careful, struggle a little bit more here. So I think the main one is really those chronic digestive issues, and then if we're getting into other activities after things like childbirth, it can affect us. So it's really important to look at those. Now, when it comes to pelvic floor, there is a little bit of an issue with this when it comes to rehabilitating, when it comes to strengthening the area. And a lot of the exercises that go around strengthening your pelvic floor involve holds, etc. And I've got on the board just over my left shoulder here a little bit about 3 sets of 10 long and short holds, and I'll touch on those in a little bit. But the biggest difficulty with the pelvic floor is, unless you really have one of these issues, these either gynecological or digestive issues, then it's very difficult necessarily to test, retest, and evaluate the strength and competences of our pelvic floor. So for any of you guys that are maybe a little bit concerned, and I mean guys a little bit more so than ladies, a little bit concerned about this but don't have any issues, perhaps attempting this little routine once or twice just to see if you have any trouble with it might be a really good place to start. But if you don't have any objective trouble with it, I wouldn't necessarily be so concerned, because it's very difficult to say, I'm going to strengthen my pelvic floor and then I'm going to add in resistance and then I'm going to add in etc. etc. We're very much fatiguing the pelvic floor rather than able to teach it to bear load or increase its ability to do work. And the main way in which it's going to be impacted for those of us that are actually just don't have any fundamental pelvic floor issues, the main way it's going to be impacted is through working as an accessory muscle on many of these exercises that are larger and more objective to measure, such as the squats, for example, or lunges, etc. So I will come back to that a little bit later on. But for those of you that do know you've got, maybe you've got that sort of things where it's stress incontinence, or when we're lifting heavy weights, we get a little bit of that there, or other symptoms and signs of those of pelvic floor dysfunction, objective dysfunction, then starting with these exercises is a really good way of learning to actually lift that pelvic floor. And what they tend to recommend is going on 10 reps of a longer hold, so holding that engagement and then relaxing, and then holding that engagement and literally feeling yourself lift up and then relax. And you can do this with the core, so it's perfectly necessary or perfectly acceptable. So lifting and engaging and then relax, 10 repetitions of that with a long hold, and then do a couple of shorter holds. So just literally engage and off, engage and off, engage and off. And this can really help start to re-engage those muscles effectively. And if you're someone who doesn't have that objective dysfunction, then you could just do this as a little test. Do you have any trouble with it? Yes, no. If you don't, then just learn to engage as we're doing some of the other exercises. And if you do, then it might be a good place to start until we can effectively do this 3 sets of 10, which seems to be the general consensus, or a lot of the different outlets that are specializing in pelvic floor dysfunction seem to recommend these sorts of exercises, because it just helps us mentally engage. But drawing back to the person that's got a little bit of back pain, or maybe a lot of back pain, and we don't necessarily have so much of an objective dysfunction, we can do this exercise without too much trouble and losing that engagement. What do we do for these people? Well, if we draw the pelvic floor as a similarity to muscles like piriformis and the other lateral hip rotators, these muscles work as an accessory to normal functioning, normal day-to-day functioning. And therefore we can't say I'm going to strengthen up my gemelli muscles, which are next to and work with muscles like piriformis that you've probably heard about, or I'm going to objectively strengthen my obturator internus and externus. Now those again are part of those lateral hip rotators that work with piriformis. We can't really objectively work on the strengthening of those muscles effectively, but when we're doing exercises like the lunges or the squats or the other exercises, maybe some of the marching bridges, etc., we can work those vicariously through that exercise, and they work as an accessory. And as we get stronger with that objective exercise, those muscles will have to catch up and keep up with everything else. So using the pelvic floor, for those of you that can do this exercise without any trouble here and don't have any signs or symptoms of more objective pelvic floor dysfunction, engaging that pelvic floor, lifting up a little bit, and engaging our core as we strengthen this whole area to provide stability to our spine, and then go about doing some of those other exercises, can be a really valuable way of just bringing the pelvic floor along for the ride as we're going through this strengthening work. And that, I think, is really the main takeaway of today's live stream, because there is that difficulty in assessing, is it strong enough? Is 10 reps enough? Is 20 reps enough? Is 3 sets of 10? Is 3 sets of 15? Where is the line? Where do we start and stop with what's necessary? Is just engaging your core. We don't get you guys to just engage your core consistently for an extended period. We get you guys to engage your core and learn how to do that. And then that core engages as we're doing other more challenging exercises. So think about that maybe in the same way, the core and the pelvic floor. Learn to engage them, get that competence with regards to the brain and the muscle, and it doesn't fatigue unnecessarily with minimal work. And then let's start engaging those muscles as we're doing the other back in shape exercises. And as you go through the various stages, you're going to improve the competence of your midsection, the core, and that pelvic floor, and their ability to function as part of a more gross engagement of our whole body to effectively, safely move us around. So that's pretty much it from me on the pelvic floor. We're getting some questions.
Okay, brilliant. Good morning, everybody. Please do pop your questions in the comments below, either on Facebook or on YouTube. I think the image that you're just about to talk about is actually really important, because we do, obviously in the program, in the Back in Shape program, we do a lot of work on the core, and I think talking about the pelvic floor, you're almost completing that circle of strength. And I think it is an important component to what we do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I rub it off now?
Yes, you can. We had a question from Sally. I know she can't join us this morning, but she did leave a message for us on the Facebook group. She's said that
essentially what's happening is when she's engaging the pelvic floor, you're getting a little bit of that irritation of the lumbar symptoms, essentially, that pulling on the sacrum. And I just wanted to explain why, because this might help a lot of you guys that might also notice similar things. What essentially is happening is we've got the sacrum here, and we've got this is the pubic symphysis on the front here, and then the pelvic floor is running in this region here. And if we think about certain muscles that make up the pelvic floor, as they contract, they're going to move that way. Okay? So we have to think, what is that doing to the sacrum? Okay, it's not going to be the strongest contraction, because compared to other muscles, it's nowhere near as strong. So we have to bear that in mind. But we've got our sacrum here. It's a bit of a bad drawing, but anyway, as it contracts, it's going to what's called counter-nutate. It's going to rotate the sacrum back a little bit. If we imagine we've got the cup here, as the pelvic floor engages, it's going to provide a little bit of stability. Because if it fails, there's a phrase that I remember we had when we were learning the neurological supply and that sort of stuff. I think it was S234 or the pelvic floor, which S234 control the pelvic floor, keeps your guts off the floor.
Yeah.
Essentially, you're like that, and it tightens in and holds everything in place. Now, as it's doing that, look at the top part of my hand. That's your sacrum. It's counter-nutating, and that's going to progress, going to just affect the disc a little bit. So what we're having is, as this rolls back, it's just going to create the platform for the disc, make it a little bit flatter, and could be why we're getting just a little bit of that irritation. And that is going to necessarily give the referral down to this area of the sacrum here, and we get that little T-zone of classic sort of L5 injury type referral. So that's something to bear in mind. Just as the sacrum gets pulled down a little bit, that might be why we're getting a little bit of this irritation on the sacrum. And I wouldn't be overly concerned about that, but it might be a good idea potentially to practice your pelvic floor engagement while you're on the towel. Just do a few little pulses while you're on the towel, because the towel is going to fix the sacrum and not allow it to move. And you might find that it allows you to engage the pelvic floor without getting that symptom. So just a little one to think about.
Okay. Yes, she mentions that across the lower back and down the centre of the sacrum, the sensation is like trying to stretch tissues with no elasticity, if that makes sense. It's actually really funny, because I kind of get something similar. I know that you always laugh at me when I'm working out in the gym doing the weights. I do tend to kind of rub my sacrum.
It's because you go like this.
No, I know, but it is. I completely understand what Sally's saying. It's just a little bit of tension. It's not a pain. It's just, you just rather it wasn't there.
Yeah, and it's this area, if we're looking back onto the sacrum, it's sort of across here, and this sort of area, and then down here. And that is generally this referral from the disc in this section here. And just as we're doing that pelvic floor engagement, there's just going to be a little bit of that movement there happening as the sacrum adopts or accommodates that engagement. And that might be what's just aggravating and irritating that area. Maybe there's a little bit of scar tissue in that area that's getting pulled on a little bit, that feeling that, something's stretching, doesn't want to stretch. But I will stress the movement is going to be very, very minor. it's not going to move a lot. Again, these muscles are not the most strong and powerful muscles that we have. They're not designed to be big prime movers like our leg muscles, so the movement will be very subtle. The reason I say that is I don't want anyone to go, oh well, I shouldn't engage the pelvic floor because it's going to pull too much. It is going to be a subtle movement. But when we're doing these subtle exercises, think about it. You're really focusing on trying to engage something. So you're really feeling a lot. You're really thinking about what exactly am I feeling. And maybe when we're doing other exercises, they're a little bit more large, a little bit more gross, a little bit more exertion is required. We don't necessarily stop and have quite that reflection. Think about it like this. If you're sat in bed at night or laid in bed before you go to bed and you just have a moment of meditation and just feel your body, feel what's going on in that moment of silence, you become aware of a lot of different things that ordinarily you wouldn't be aware of. And when we're doing an exercise like the pelvic floor, it requires a lot of concentration, much like the core engagement. And I know people sometimes notice the same thing on the core engagement, and that may play into it a little bit as well. We're listening more, so we hear quieter voices. Something to think about.
Interesting. Cheryl also agrees. She says, yes, it pulls on my sacrum too. I wonder if this is more of an issue than we know of.
I think it's
especially
something
in ladies, maybe.
I think it's something that people will notice more, but I don't think it's necessarily as much of a concern objectively as the symptoms might suggest, because I do think it's one of those exercises where we feel it a little bit more because everything is a lot quieter.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Could it also be because when you're going through the rehab and you are training these muscles, the way that I see it in the gym, especially if I'm putting the weight up that session, I will get the pain more, and I almost feel as though it's like my glutes are working more, so that they're pulling the structure, and that's the kind of tension that I feel. So perhaps maybe in the back in shape, when people are doing the reps, more reps, or they've changed to a higher resistance band, they're going to be getting more of that ache and pain. Just quickly, I did want to just ask Cheryl's other question. She said, I find I engage my pelvic floor all the time when I engage my core. Is this okay? That's
perfect. That's what you should do, essentially. So that's fine. If you think about it, and I remember doing a meditation at one point, and it was really good the way it was done. And it was, you lift your pelvic floor up first and then engage the core to follow. So it's like almost someone's coming up underneath you and just squeezing everything in, and that's perfectly fine. That's sensible. That's a good way to do it. And a lot of meditation techniques where you're led down or sat up will teach you to kind of have that energy coming up you, and as you engage, and you do it with the breath there as well. But I just wanted to touch on what you said about going up in weight. We don't quite realise, but there's a lot of tendinous structures in this region here. We have the whole thoracolumbar fascia coming down in this region here, which is going to be a tendinous type structure. And then we've got all of the aponeurosis of the glutes, which again is more tendons plugging into this area. We've got a tremendous amount of ligaments around here connecting the L5 to the iliac crest, which is basically our hip bones up here. And all of these structures are tendinous. So as you're going through, like Lara said, the rehab phases, and you're maybe moving on to lunges or something like that challenges these muscles a little bit more, remember your muscles are adapting a little bit faster than the tendons are. Those tendons still need to adapt. They still need to remodel and lay down collagen. Like we discussed the other day, it takes a bit of time for them to do this. Even if there's no problem, they will still adapt. And that's why we also talk sometimes about when you're going through the Back in Shape program and you're making a bit of progress, sometimes it's worth just plateauing for a moment, maybe 3 or 4 days, when you feel like I could go up to maybe 5 sets of 10 from 4 sets of 10. But just having that extra 3 or 4 days, maybe up to a week, to just plateau at that exercise, get at that level, get comfortable, and allow some of these other structures to catch up, that can be something that's worthwhile. You see this in the extreme in where bodybuilders using anabolic steroids, they suffer from tendon problems because the anabolics help with the muscle growth to a tremendous degree. The muscles adapt tremendously quickly, but the tendons don't respond in the same manner because they're not as metabolically active. So you get a disproportionate strengthening of the muscle units compared to the tendons, and that's when we can really get caught out if we're not academically sensible about the way in which we proceed. So we've gone from talking about gynecological issues all the way to using steroids in bodybuilding, but it's something worth noting with reference to this pain that you might get in this sort of T-zone in the sacrum. Okay,
and just talking about lunges, I've got a quick question. Is that why sometimes you recommend that you don't lunge too low?
Yes, because the lunging, people, I don't think a lot of people realise just how challenging those lunges are. They engage so many of those lateral hip rotations. Many people are talking about piriformis, and that's just one. You know, we've got our hip out here, and obviously runs down like that, and it's in the hip socket, which is wherever we're going to put it. And then you've got the sacrum over here, and you've got like piriformis is like a finger. It's tiny, and then you've got the gemelli muscles and the obturator muscles, and they all make up a big sheet, which is the lateral hip rotator complex. And these are small muscles. Like I mentioned earlier, in terms of how we can compare the pelvic floor to these muscles, when we're doing the lunges, these guys are really going to be working overtime to help stabilize alongside glute medius and minimus, which come up this way, which aren't as strong as the big glute max. So they're having to stabilize the movement, much like the small, the rotator cuff muscles, which are tiny in our shoulders really, but there's lots of them that have to work in a coordinated manner. And when we're doing something like the lunge, it's a little bit more because it's one leg working, but we have those stabilizers that are working over time to really try and learn to stabilize that hip and the whole body with the large powerful glutes and leg muscles, glute max and the strong leg muscles. And they're working through ranges on their own in a way that they're not used to, so they can get a little bit of fatigue, they can get a little bit of what's called DOMS the next day, and it's not going to feel quite the same as everything else. It's going to feel a little bit sore, and they're going to get a little bit tight afterwards, especially the first time you make that foray into doing the lunges. So take it easy, don't progress too quickly in that, but it's okay to get a little bit of discomfort, especially on the lunges.
Okay, awesome. And then would you just recommend maybe ice afterwards?
I wouldn't necessarily ice here, but ice in this aponeurosis would be helpful.
So would that be on top of the sacrum?
Yeah, so it would be sort of, when we talk about finding those two bony bits, and those two bony bits at the base of your spine are around about here. Oh, actually a little bit lower than that. So if there's the sacrum there, they're a little bit lower. So basically find those two bony bits and just put a big ice pack. That way you hit L5, S1 and L4, but you also hit some of those at the aponeurosis of the sacrum. I'm doing a little bit, but we have to bear in mind that we don't necessarily want to do it for quite as long. Now, when we're using the things like the icing on the discs and those spinal structures deep inside, if it requires a bit of time for that cold to actually penetrate deep enough to the tissues that we're targeting. When we're talking about the aponeurosis here and these tendinous attachment sites, they're a lot closer to the surface, so we don't want to overcook it. Maybe we'd go for 3 minutes or so at this region. If there's something wrong there, if there's a little bit of inflammation on those tendons, we just knock it down a touch.
Okay, great, super interesting. Okay, wonderful. I think that is everything for today. Yes, brilliant. Okay. Thank you everyone for your questions.
Well, hopefully that was helpful, a little bit interesting as well. We went off topic a little bit towards the back end of there, but drawing the similarities between that pelvic floor and something like those lateral hip rotators can help you better understand how they work in reality, how they work to provide stability alongside other muscles like the core and the obliques, etc., to allow us to effectively move the body around from A to B. So hopefully you found it helpful. You've got a few active tips there if you do have some pelvic floor dysfunction, and you've got a little test if you don't but you're concerned about it. That 3 sets of 10 long holds, 3 sets of 10 short holds, and give it a go. Let us know how you get on with that. If you are new to the channel and you found this video helpful, then please do consider subscribing. We do these live streams. If you have the notification bell hit, you will get a notification when we go live, so you can join us next time for the Q&A section as well. Thanks for watching. Have a great afternoon today, and we will see you next time with another live stream. Thanks so much for joining us on today's video. Hopefully you found it packed full of useful information. If you want to learn more about the premium Back in Shape membership, there's going to be a video somewhere underneath here. And if you want to stay up to date or tune in to some of our more recent live streams and the Q&As at the end of those, then that's going to be down here. And remember, you can subscribe to the channel up here and hit the notification bell to make sure you know when we next go live, so you can join us for our next live stream and Q&A.